Most people think they already know how medieval archers fought thin leather clothes, slow dramatic shots, and perfect accuracy like in every movie scene. But real English archers lived a completely different reality, one built on brutal training, battlefield chaos, and weapons so powerful they reshaped the bodies of the men who used them. Their role wasn't decorative or cinematic. It was deadly, disciplined, and absolutely essential to how medieval armies won wars. What you're about to hear is the truth behind the longbow, how archers actually fought, survived, and dominated battlefields in ways Hollywood has never shown. Number 1. The real job of an English medieval archer. Most people imagine medieval archers as background characters, lightly armored hunters taking relaxed shots like in fantasy movies. But an English archer in the Middle Ages was nothing close to that. He was a hardened professional conditioned by years of mandatory practice, shaped by national laws that forced every commoner to train with the bow from childhood. For these men, archery wasn't a hobby. It was the backbone of England's military identity, something that defined the kingdom's power in Europe for nearly 2 centuries. Their job wasn't simply releasing arrows, it was creating psychological terror, disrupting enemy movement, and overwhelming advancing forces long before swords, axes, and lances touched each other. Real archers didn't stand in neat lines like actors. They moved constantly, working together as a coordinated machine, adjusting for wind, slopes, mud, and the unpredictable chaos of battle. The fields they fought on were rarely clean grasslands. They were churned up pits of wet earth, smoke from burning wagons or torches, screaming men, and clashing metal. Archers had to operate under extreme pressure, knowing that even a few seconds of hesitation could let cavalry reach them. They weren't passive support units. They were the first wave of destruction, the force that shaped how the battle would unfold. Their strength wasn't just in the bow they held, it was in their discipline. Orders came fast, and archers had to react instantly to signals from commanders. They aimed by instinct, not by careful sighting. They shot at formations, not individuals, and their goal was never to pick off a single knight, but to break the will of hundreds. Their bodies were conditioned in ways modern soldiers rarely experience. Repeatedly drawing a 120 to 160 pound war bow didn't just build muscle, it permanently altered bone structures, twisting shoulders, thickening arm joints, and leaving fingerprints of their craft visible on skeletons centuries later. This wasn't gentle training. It was a lifetime of repetitive strain. And once the battle began, an archer could be expected to shoot for hours, drawing that monstrous bow hundreds of times, even as his fingers bled and his muscles screamed. Hollywood gives archers elegance, but real longbowmen were brutal instruments of war, and they treated the battlefield the same way. Their job also extended beyond shooting. Archers were responsible for preparing the ground, positioning sharpened stakes in front of themselves, building small trenches, scouting terrain, and helping shape battle conditions. They often formed the first and last defensive lines of an English army. And because the longbow was the national weapon, English commanders relied on archers more heavily than on knights. The knights were elite, yes, but the archers were the real killing engine of the army. They created chaos, softened the enemy, shattered formations, drove horses into panic, and turned armored soldiers into easy targets. This is why the English victories at Crécy, Poitiers, and Agincourt were not miracles. They were the result of a military system built around archers who understood their job. Break the enemy before he ever reaches them. Number 2. How longbows really worked in combat. The medieval longbow was nothing like the neat, straight, cinematic shots modern audiences expect. An English archer rarely pointed his bow directly at a target unless the enemy was extremely close. Real combat was about indirect fire shooting high into the air to create devastating arrow rain. Hundreds or thousands of arrows coming down at once generated force similar to ballistic projectiles. From 250 to 300 yards away, archers weren't trying to pick off individuals. They were acting like medieval artillery crews. Their goal was to disrupt enemy formations, blind them with fear, and create non-stop pressure. When knights advanced, they had to push through a storm that hammered their armor, hit their horses, and shattered their discipline. Even if an arrow didn't pierce plate armor directly, The impact alone could knock a knight off balance or injure him. Horses were even more vulnerable, and once cavalry lost momentum, they became trapped targets. At closer ranges, archers switched tactics instantly. They lowered their aim and fired direct shots that hammered into weak spots in armor. The armpits, the visor slits, the groin, the back of the knee, or any exposed joints. Bodkin arrows were shaped like narrow spikes designed to punch through mail, while broader arrowheads could cut flesh, tendons, or the leather straps holding armor plates together. Movies tend to show archers releasing one dramatic arrow every few seconds, but a trained longbowman could release 10 to 12 arrows per minute under combat pressure. Multiply that by several hundred archers, and the battlefield became a deadly environment where thousands of arrows filled the air every minute. Contemporary eyewitnesses described it as a hailstorm, saying the sky literally dimmed as the volleys flew overhead. Coordinating all of this wasn't random. English armies used horns, flags, and shouted commands to synchronize volleys. Archers shot in waves. The first group fired, the second knocked, the third prepared, and the fourth shot slightly later to create an unbroken cycle of arrows. This rhythm kept constant pressure on the enemy, overwhelming them before they closed the distance. Archers were also trained to read the battlefield like artillery officers. They observed enemy clustering, cavalry positioning, wind direction, and ground conditions. A commander could order a volley to land specifically on densely packed infantry or on exposed flanks. The soundscape of such a battle was nothing like what movies portray. You'd hear the snap of thousands of bowstrings, the hiss of arrows cutting through the air, and the sharp, ugly crack when an arrow struck metal or bone. Soldiers described hearing arrows whistle past their helmets like angry insects. Archers were not static. They moved forward when the enemy broke, repositioned behind infantry when lines shifted, and took advantage of chaos by firing opportunistically. The longbow wasn't used gently. It was pulled to maximum draw every time, unleashing enormous force. This constant strain frayed bowstrings and damaged arrows, so archers carried spares in waxed pouches to keep moisture out. The entire system was designed for sustained combat, not the short, dramatic exchanges Hollywood loves. In real war, longbows were relentless tools of pressure, wearing down the enemy until knights, infantry, and even experienced commanders found themselves overwhelmed by fatigue, fear, and confusion. Number 3. Why English archers dominated the battlefield. English archers were not just skilled, they were the result of a national military culture that practically built its entire strategy around the longbow. The reason they dominated wasn't a single advantage, but a combination of physical training, tactical planning, economic investment, and smart battlefield design. Boys were required to practice archery from an early age, often starting around age 6 or 7. This wasn't soft recreational shooting, it was repetitive, disciplined training aimed at building the strength needed to handle a 120-pound warbow by adulthood. Archaeological studies on skeletons of medieval archers show enlarged bone joints, curved shoulders, and spinal deformities caused by constant strain. In many ways, the English longbowman was a specialized athlete, but one shaped by hard labor, not sports. They weren't peasants forced to fight. Many archers were proud professionals who earned decent wages. Their pay was higher than that of regular infantry, and in foreign campaigns, some archers even earned bonuses or shares of plunder. This financial incentive created a competitive warrior class that trained seriously and traveled with armies across Europe. Their status grew as victories mounted. At battles like Crécy and Poitiers, archers didn't just participate, they were the decisive factor that shattered French cavalry charges considered unstoppable at the time. Another reason for their dominance was England's unique strategic approach. English commanders used terrain better than almost any other European army of the period. They placed archers on slopes to increase range, behind muddy ground to slow down enemy charges, and flanked knights with archers to create overlapping kill zones. They positioned rows of pointed stakes in front of archer lines to stop horses dead in their tracks. This combination of terrain engineering, defensive layering, and concentrated firepower turned archers into an unbreakable force multiplier. Unlike other nations, England integrated archers into every part of its battle doctrine. They weren't auxiliaries, they were the backbone. Knights, infantry, and even siege tactics were adjusted to maximize archer effectiveness. At Agincourt, mud and narrow terrain funneled the French into a deadly corridor, where English archers tore their ranks apart before the French even reached melee range. No other European force used archers with such commitment. While other armies relied on crossbows or hired mercenaries, England forged a national weapon system. Longbows were mass-produced, stored in royal arsenals, and distributed to soldiers on campaign. Every level of the military, from kings to local lords, invested in archery. This unified system explains why English archers dominated even when outnumbered. Their advantage was not magic, it was organization, training, and strategy executed with unwavering discipline. Number 4. What archers actually wore and carried. Hollywood often dresses archers in stylish leather armor with perfect hair and iconic quivers, but real medieval archers looked far more rugged. Their clothing was practical, not decorative. Most wore padded gambeson's thick quilted jackets made of layers of linen or wool. These absorbed impact, offered flexibility, and protected against glancing blows. Some gambesons were reinforced with leather patches or small metal plates, but heavy armor was avoided because archers needed full shoulder mobility to draw powerful longbows. Plate armor restricted movement and added weight, so it wasn't ideal for shooting. Helmets, however, were essential. Archers commonly wore kettle hats, wide-brimmed helmets that deflected blows, debris, and even downward-falling arrows from friendly volleys. Their gear was designed for sustained combat. They carried extra bowstrings treated with wax and fats to resist moisture, since a wet string could snap or lose tension. Arrows weren't stored in decorative quivers. They were kept in linen bags, wooden boxes, or stuck into the ground in front of them for rapid access. War arrows were thick, heavy shafts over 3 feet long, each tipped with specialized heads. Bodkins for armor penetration, or broadheads for cutting down unarmored infantry. An archer might bring 60 to 100 arrows to a major battle, because volleys consumed ammunition shockingly fast. In addition to the bow, archers carried a range of sidearms. Short swords, daggers, bucklers, and sometimes small axes or mallets. They needed these weapons because once the enemy closed the distance, archers often fought in the melee. They weren't shield wall soldiers, but they could defend themselves and support the line. They also carried wooden stakes known as palisades or archer stakes. These were sharpened posts hammered into the ground at an angle to halt cavalry charges. Each archer was responsible for carrying, planting, and adjusting his stake based on commander orders. Archers didn't stand perfectly still like movie characters. They constantly shifted weight, stepped forward or back, bent to retrieve arrows, tightened bowstrings, and watched for signals. Mud, rain, and exhaustion were constant companions. Their equipment had to be durable, not beautiful. Their sleeves were worn thin from bow friction. Their fingers were often wrapped in leather or cloth to prevent tearing. Real archers were gritty, weather-beaten professionals who cared far more about staying alive in a brutal environment than looking heroic. Everything they carried, every strap, knife, pouch, stake, and arrow, served one purpose: to keep them shooting as long as the battle demanded. Number 5. How archers survived on the battlefield. Surviving a medieval battlefield required far more than strength with a bow. It demanded constant awareness and the ability to read danger before it arrived. English archers were valuable assets, and they knew that enemy commanders often targeted them first, understanding that removing the archers could collapse an entire English battle plan. This is why longbowmen never relied on armor alone. Instead, they treated the terrain as their main protection, choosing elevated ridges, forest edges, muddy fields, or narrow approaches that forced the enemy into predictable paths. Shooting downhill wasn't just easier. It increased arrow velocity and accuracy, making volleys hit harder. Archers also paid attention to how the earth beneath their feet affected stability. Dry ground allowed fast repositioning, while muddy fields slowed movement but worked brilliantly when they needed to trap charging cavalry. They spread out rather than clustering together, maintaining enough distance so that enemy crossbows or javelins couldn't wipe out dozens of men with a single shot. Even their spacing was calculated. They formed staggered lines that allowed uninterrupted shooting while preventing one incoming threat from cutting down an entire row. Archers didn't rely purely on natural features. When terrain was unfavorable, they shaped it with their own hands. They carried wooden stakes often 6 to 8 feet long sharpened and driven into the earth at an angle facing the enemy. These stakes formed a front line of jagged points capable of stopping a cavalry charge cold. Horses weren't suicidal, and trained war horses would hesitate or veer away from these barriers, giving archers precious seconds to fire. The stakes didn't make the archers invincible, but they created enough disruption to break the perfect timing of a charge. This mattered, because once a cavalry charge lost its speed and formation, it became a chaotic cluster of targets instead of an unstoppable hammer. Psychological survival was another skill that mattered tremendously. The battlefield was deafening. Metal on metal impacts, hoofbeats shaking the earth, men shouting orders and insults, and war cries echoing in every direction. Archers amplified that chaos deliberately. Their shouts, whistles, and jeers served multiple purposes. They intimidated the enemy, strengthened morale among their own troops, and concealed the stress they felt. No medieval soldier was immune to fear, but archers learned to channel it into aggression and rhythm. They often created the battle's first sound signature, the unified snap of thousands of bowstrings. That sound alone could spread panic across enemy lines, especially among lightly armored troops who had heard stories of longbow devastation. Archers constantly studied the sky. Wind direction, humidity, and incoming rain were threats as real as any knight's blade. A sudden gust could send arrows off course, rain could loosen bowstrings, and heavy fog could render long-range volleys useless. Because of this, archers carried spare strings sealed in waxed pouches, kept their bows oiled, and adjusted their shooting style mid-battle. They might shift from high-angle volleys to low direct shots the moment weather changed. This adaptability kept them from becoming predictable. Retreating was also part of their survival strategy, and they practiced it just as much as shooting. They didn't panic and run. They fell back in controlled steps, keeping their formation intact and staying behind their stakes until the last safe moment. They knew that if they broke formation, cavalry could scatter and trample them easily. When enemies finally reached their line, archers didn't collapse in fear or simply flee. They dropped their bow's fragile tools that would snap in close combat and immediately drew daggers, hatchets, or short swords. The misericord, a long, narrow dagger, was especially common because it pierced gaps in armor. Archers might not have been heavily armored warriors, but they were absolutely capable of lethal close-quarters fighting. Their survival was built on discipline, clever positioning, teamwork with infantry, and the ability to adapt faster than the enemy could respond. Number 6. What battles actually looked like for archers. Real medieval battles involving longbowmen were nothing like the romanticized scenes in modern films. The ground was usually soaked, churned by days of marching, and littered with debris from previous skirmishes. Archers didn't stand in neat lines. Instead, they formed broad arcs or wings that extended far from the center, creating an enveloping shape that forced the enemy to advance under fire from multiple directions. Commanders positioned them with surgical precision, taking into account hills, wind patterns, sun angle, and choke points. Before any swords clashed, archers opened the fight with coordinated volleys designed to throw the enemy into confusion. These weren't celebratory or symbolic shots. They were timed to land exactly when enemy formations started moving, hitting the largest concentrations of troops. The sky could fill with thousands of arrows in seconds. Soldiers described these volleys as sounding like heavy rainfall or hail pounding against metal. The psychological impact alone was enough to break inexperienced troops. Horses reared or stumbled when struck, and even heavily armored knights felt the shock of arrows slamming against their breastplates or helmets. Contrary to popular belief, arrows rarely pierced high-quality plate armor head-on, but the goal wasn't always penetration. A powerful arrow hitting a knight at full gallop could unbalance him, kill his horse, or fracture bones beneath the armor. Medieval warfare was about breaking momentum, not always causing instant death. Archers changed tactics constantly. As enemy troops moved closer, long-range arcs became medium-range plunging shots, and eventually direct, flat shots aimed at specific weak points: visor slits, armpit openings, thigh gaps, or the back of the legs. Some archers targeted horses exclusively, because a fallen horse created a pileup of men and steel that stopped entire formations in their tracks. At Agincourt, for example, the combination of deep mud and relentless arrow fire turned a proud French cavalry force into a struggling mass of bodies unable to move or fight effectively. Archers didn't stop firing when melee began. They simply increased precision. When arrows ran low, archers didn't stop contributing. They scavenged. They moved between bodies on the ground, retrieving unbroken arrows, pulling shafts from fallen shields, and collecting war arrows fired earlier. Some archers carried small knives specifically for cutting bodkin heads off broken shafts so they could reuse them in future battles. This scavenging process wasn't desperation. It was standard practice, part of maintaining constant pressure on the enemy. Archers also played a strategic mobility role during the chaos of battle. While knights and foot soldiers were locked front to front, archers swung around the edges of the battlefield, circling to strike exposed sides or rear units. They acted almost like fast skirmishers, using their lighter armor to outmaneuver heavily armored troops. Their movement gave commanders real-time awareness of enemy shifts. Archers often relayed changes through shouted signals, waving banners, or horn blasts, making them an essential communication network in the fog of war. The experience for archers was exhausting. They drew bows repeatedly until their arms trembled. Mud pulled at their boots, blood from the wounded mixed with rain around their feet, and smoke from burning equipment made breathing difficult. But even under these conditions, they maintained the rhythm of combat. Their discipline allowed English armies to defeat larger forces again and again throughout the 100 Years' War. Number 7. The reality of training, pain, and long-term life of archers. Training for the longbow began so early that it shaped a person's life before they ever understood war. Boys were given light bows at first, not to teach accuracy, but to build the muscle memory and raw strength needed to handle a war bow later. The English longbow wasn't just a weapon, it was a physical challenge. A war bow often had a draw weight between 120 and 160 pounds. Far beyond what most modern people can pull even once. Archers had to draw it repeatedly for hours, in rain or cold, while maintaining precision. Training involved holding the bow at full draw, shooting while breathing heavily, firing while kneeling, and even practicing shooting behind partial cover. They learned how to judge distance instinctively, how to account for wind, and how to anticipate enemy movements. This lifelong training came with a physical cost. Skeletons recovered from the Mary Rose, Henry VIII's famous warship, showed dramatic deformities. Archers had enlarged left arms, twisted rib cages, and thickened shoulder joints from decades of drawing heavy bows. The spine curved in unnatural ways, and the wrist bones were enlarged from stress. These injuries weren't from accidents, they were simply the price of being a longbowman. Chronic pain was normal. Archers lived with stiff shoulders, aching wrists, and finger joints that sometimes swelled painfully in cold weather. Yet they kept training, because consistent practice was required to maintain their strength. Missing a few months of training could weaken the muscles needed to draw a war bow effectively. Their responsibilities extended beyond shooting. Archers were craftsmen in their own right. They understood how to repair bowstrings, how to wax them to prevent moisture damage, and how to straighten arrow shafts heated gently over coals. They monitored humidity constantly, because a bow exposed to wet conditions became slower and less reliable. Many archers carried small repair kits with spare strings, beeswax, sharpening tools, and even strips of linen for emergency fixes. Competitions were part of everyday life. Archery ranges in English towns hosted regular contests where archers shot at distant targets, moving targets, or even targets designed to represent armored opponents. These competitions sharpened speed and accuracy, and also encouraged local pride. Winning brought prestige and sometimes money. But competitions went beyond sport. They were preparation for war. Archers trained to fire while exhausted. They ran short sprints and shot immediately after, simulating battlefield stress. They practiced drawing and firing in unison with dozens of other men, syncing their timing with shouted commands. Off the battlefield, archers played multiple roles. Their ability to track movement and judge terrain made them excellent scouts and messengers. They hunted for the army, providing food during campaigns. Their observational skills were so valued that archers often stood guard in dangerous frontier regions. But their life expectancy was limited. They were deployed frequently, often in the most decisive and dangerous battles. Even though they were trained professionals, survival wasn't guaranteed. Many archers fought in dozens of engagements over their lifetime, facing constant fatigue, disease, and the brutal reality of medieval warfare. Despite the hardship, they forged a lasting legacy. English archers changed European warfare, shaping military strategy for centuries. Their discipline, training, and near-mythical endurance made them one of the most respected and feared forces in medieval history. Their story isn't glamorous, but it is brutally real-built on pain, strength, precision, and a lifetime dedicated to mastering a weapon that demanded everything from those who chose to wield it.